All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar on the EUDR and ways to get ready for compliance. We're very much looking forward to hosting this webinar for you today, where we will be addressing the EUDR key elements and provide guidance on how you can pragmatically address requirements within your company. Speaking to you today are my colleague Selina Radke, who works as a consultant at LRQA and is joining us from Frankfurt today. My name is Maximilian Weimann and I am an associate consultant and I'm sitting in Hamburg. We're both part of the LRQA Advisory Team Europe, and together with a team of more than 25 experts, we support our clients to navigate a new era of risk. Before we dive right into today's topic, I would like to introduce a few housekeeping rules for the webinar. We will be keeping you muted during the presentation to avoid disturbances. If you have questions, please place those in the chat box. We will be coming back to your questions at the end of the presentation, where we will have reserved about 15 minutes for a Q&A session. The slides will be shared with you after the webinar. That means we will be recording the webinar so you can watch or share it later. Please note, in the webinar, LRQA does not give legal advice. The following explanations are based on our own interpretation of the legislation. And with that, I hand over to my colleague, Selina.
Perfect. Thank you, Max, and also a warm welcome from my side. To start with, a few words on LRQA for those of you who are not yet familiar with our services. LRQA is a leading global assurance partner with quite a broad portfolio of different solutions and fields of expertise. And what we observe is that at the moment we're moving towards a new era defined by heightened ESG expectations, fragmented global supply chains, and also cyber attacks. So a new approach to risk management is needed, and we call this new era of risk management Assurance 4.0. And for us, Assurance 4.0 is very much about providing companies with greater visibility of these challenges and enabling them to really make more informed, data-driven decisions. Our solutions consequently address 5 client challenges that we see emerging, again, based on the global trends around ESG, supply chain integrity, and cybersecurity. And this starts with assuring key assets and management systems and helping companies to demonstrate compliance with legislation, but also global industry best practices. So, for example, we do offer certification against ISO standards, inspection services in the area of especially product quality, food safety, etc. In addition, we are also involved in the cybersecurity business and help clients to get more resilient against cyber risks by offering services like security testing, incident responses, and also security trainings. Achieving product integrity and the need for safe, authentic, and high-quality products is another central challenge that we see emerging, especially in the food and healthcare sector. So again, here we are doing food safety audits, certifications, and trainings. And then, of course, we also have that strong focus on a range of sustainability topics and ESG risks. And that's also home turf, especially to our advisory team in Europe. And on the one hand side, there's this big push towards net zero, and that comes with its own complex risks. And here we offer a range of climate services to support our clients in, for example, carbon accounting, setting climate targets, making sure that they report in line with the new ESRS CSRD standards. And then on the other hand, meeting responsible sourcing demands is becoming imperative, especially with the ever-evolving supply chain and due diligence legislation, be it CSDDD, the EU Forced Labor Product Ban, or now also the EU Deforestation regulation. And closely related to this, we implement, for example, on-site social and environmental compliance audits and provide on-site trainings. And we advise and support companies with the implementation of corporate due diligence processes and the development of responsible sourcing programs. And that is core of our advisory business. So more precisely, supporting clients with our advisory services can mean that we run clients' entire supply chain programs, so following more of a program managed approach. It can also mean that we deliver on-site or remote trainings within the supply chain, or we help clients identify and analyze ESG risk data through our proprietary EIQ Analyze platform. And then within our consulting teams, we leverage all these different insights to provide very pragmatic and targeted advice to our clients. that as a brief introduction on our company. Now, what are the goals for our webinar today? We will give you an overview of the EU Deforestation Regulation so that after the webinar, you ideally have a better feeling about what the EUDR is and why it is important, whether and how your company could be affected, or at least know how you can assess whether you will be in scope. And ideally, you should also have an initial idea on how to address the necessary due diligence requirements should you be in scope of the EUDR. Again, feel free to post any questions in the question box. We will leave some time in the end to address them. And with that, I think we can get it started. And to start right off, we have prepared a brief poll for you, as we're interested in hearing how the EUDR is currently being perceived within your company. Is it a top priority topic with full attention by management? Is it rather unclear yet whether and how relevant the EUDR is for you? Is your company maybe taking a rather observing stance, or maybe you have decided that the EUDR is not, or only of very little relevance to you? Feel free to just select the answer that at the moment suits you best. Please also note that the answers are collected anonymously, and I'll just give it a bit of a time for you to select an answer, and then we'll have a look at the results together. And I can see answers coming in. I'll just leave it a bit more time. Perfect, and there we have the results. And it's actually quite interesting to see that we have a head-on-head run between the topic being a super high priority versus still not quite clear yet with how much ambition maybe you should pursue the topic. So that's very interesting to see. And then also a few that say, okay, we know, or we want to know what it's all about, but we're rather waiting and observing maybe also how others are doing it. And that's also reflecting quite good what we experience in relation to or based on client exchanges. So thank you for your honest feedback on that. Without further ado, let's get started with a brief overview of the EUDR and why it matters, introduced to you by my colleague Max.
Yes, so we know that the EUDR's primary aim is to tackle deforestation. So why is deforestation an issue, and why is it an issue for the EU to tackle? You may have come across headlines, news articles, or social media posts highlighting that deforestation and forest degradation are still occurring at an alarming rate. And at the moment, voluntary action from communities doesn't seem to cut it. Therefore, regulation is essential to shift the system. In 2023, according to the World Resources Institute, the area of 10 football pitches of primary rainforest were destroyed every minute. Now, some might question why deforestation is such a big deal if trees are a renewable resource that grow back anyways. The problem is that deforestation takes place at such a pace and such a large scale that our natural forests can't regrow in time. Note here that forests are not just fields of timber. Forests are very complex ecosystems that deliver critical ecosystem services, and on top of that, also host roughly 80% of Earth's land animals and plant species. Consequently, halting deforestation means safeguarding biodiversity, which is crucial for resilience against climate change. And speaking of climate change, forests also serve as vital carbon sinks, with deforestation ranking as the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after direct fossil fuel burning. So losing forests disrupts regional to global cycles, which can lead to extreme temperature changes, disrupted water cycles, which in the end affects us all. So with the EU now being a major importer of commodities linked to deforestation, such as leather, chocolate, tires, furniture, you name it, the EU knows that union consumption is a considerable driver of deforestation and forest degradation. To take responsibility and tackle this problem, the EU has adopted the EU Deforestation Regulation. With this information in mind, what does the EUDR now entail in a nutshell? First of all, what is the purpose? The EUDR's aim and purpose is to allow only deforestation-free and legal products on the EU market. In scope of the EUDR is any company placing or making available on the EU market any of the defined in-scope commodities or derived products. In scope, there are 7 defined commodities and derived products, which is an extended scope compared to the prior EU timber regulation, which only covered timber and timber products. To now fulfill the requirements, companies need to exercise due diligence and prove that their products are deforestation-free and produced in accordance with local legislation. We can all agree on the importance of tackling deforestation to protect our livelihoods. However, it's also important to understand that the EUDR poses direct financial risks to companies, because ensuring compliance can be a costly endeavor. As we delve into the requirements shortly, you will realize that they are far from simple, and to ensure full compliance down to every product batch, a lot of time and resources will need to be invested, and it is important to keep an eye out for small details or the fine print, so to say. The EU itself has estimated in its impact assessment compliance-related costs for companies to amount between $170 million to $2.5 billion per year. However, the costs of non-compliance can also be substantial. This will much depend on the penalties that EU member states set and the level of enforcement. But right now, the law foresees fines of up to 4% of turnover. Fines also mean that products are confiscated or temporarily prohibited from trading. This creates a huge risk of supply chain disruptions. If you source products that are in scope, and even if you're not importing them yourselves, you may not be able to use them if your suppliers fail to meet the obligations under the EUDR. The reputational risks are not to be estimated here. So once a company or an investor is associated with deforestation, this can lead to direct loss in trust or decreased confidence. In turn, proactively managing deforestation and other ESG-related risks helps to minimize risks and subsequently can help to increase value and ensure long-term sustainability of the business. Now, with this in mind, let's look at what you can do to prepare for the EUDR. My colleague Selina will take over from here.
Thank you, Max. Exactly. So before looking at which types of companies are in scope, let's actually have a look at the timeline. I'm just gonna, there we go. And what we see here is that the EUDR's requirements start applying end of December this year. So companies have now about 8 to 7 months left to prepare. Micro and small undertakings get an additional 6 months for preparation. Looking back, everything started with the European Commission's proposal, which was published in November 2021. And about a year later already, an agreement was reached between the EU institutions. On that note, this 1 year period is actually quite a quick process if you look at EU negotiations, and that might actually also explain, and to some extent, how the regulation is made up and written. End of June last year, the EUDR then entered into force. And looking forward, the Commission plans to carry out several reviews of the scope and the approach of the EUDR. And these are highlighted through the little blue dashes on the timeline. So by summer of next year, for example, the Commission wants to check whether it needs to include financial institutions into the scope as well. And it will also review whether there's a need to expand the scope to other commodities, such as maize. Now, who are the companies that need to get ready for implementation by end of this year? Whether or not a company is in scope of the EUDR very much depends on the commodities and products that it trades on the union market. While the EU timber regulation only focused on wood, the EUDR now defines 7 relevant commodities, which are further related to over 70 derived products that are in scope. So next to wood, the EUDR applies also to cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber, and soy. And relevant derived products include, for example, just to name a few, meat and leather of cattle, but also cocoa powder and chocolate paste, palm oil and glycerol, but then also paper and packaging products, and also rubber tires or rubber gloves. If you want to review the full list of products that are in scope, we advise you to please check Annex 1 of the regulation, because there you have the list of all relevant in-scope products together with their custom tariff CN codes, so the custom tariff numbers according to the combined nomenclature coding system of the EU. In more practical terms, the key message here is that the EUDR is not only relevant for the wood and furniture industry, which may come up first when you think about deforestation and related industries, but also other industries such as food and beverages, for example, or the automotive industry or the chemicals industry. And then again, of course, also the packaging and logistics industry. If you are a food retail company, for example, you may import cocoa paste that you then use in your baking goods. Note here that the baking goods themselves, so chocolate cake, chocolate biscuits, etc., are not in scope of the EUDR. However, the import of the chocolate would be in scope. And even if you're buying from EU-based suppliers that already, have to fulfill the regulation requirements themselves, you may nevertheless face high risks of supply chain disruptions if your suppliers don't make sure they adequately meet the requirements. Similarly, companies producing specialty chemicals may, for example, use derivatives of palm oil or even soy to produce their respective chemical ingredients. And here glycerine is, for example, in scope, and through that, the EUDR may also apply to those companies in that industry. Now, some of the companies attending may source in-scope products, and some may also produce and sell in-scope products. But at the same time, I assume that at least most of your companies are not typical import-export only companies. Unfortunately, and that is a crucial difference also in comparison to the EU timber regulation, you may nevertheless be affected, because the EUDR not only applies to importers, but also to those further down in the supply chain that place a relevant product on the union market. So if a company places or makes available on the union market one of the listed products or exports it from there, no matter where in the supply chain the company is located, it will be in scope of the EUDR, irrespective of its size and location. And we'll have a look at a more practical example later. But for now, it is important to understand that the EUDR differentiates here between so-called operators and traders. The operator is any natural or legal person who, in the course of a commercial activity, places relevant products on the market or exports them. And the focus here is very much on this first placing of the product on the market. And importantly, it also covers those companies that transform a product into another in-scope product further down in the supply chain. So for example, if you're a company that sources wood and then transforms it into wooden frames as a final product, then even further down in the supply chain, you are in scope for those wooden frames because they are listed in the Annex 1. The trader is then any person in the supply chain other than the operator who, in the course of a commercial activity, makes relevant products available on the market. So the focus here is much more on supplying a product that has already been placed on the market for further distribution, consumption, or use on the union market. I know this is quite theoretical, but important to remember for now is that it is very important for you to check where and how exactly your company is in scope, given the EUDR's product focus and expansion to companies also further down in the supply chain. Consequently, when checking whether you're in scope, we suggest to follow the following steps. First, assess whether your company supplies or uses any agricultural commodities or derived products on the union market. And here we recommend creating a list of all the products that your company is placing on the union market or planning to place there in the future. And this list should also include those products or commodities that you import into the EU, even if you only import them for further processing into a completely different good. So as a car manufacturer, for example, you may want to make sure that you also check whether you are importing leather of cattle, for example, to then further process that into car seats. Your products should also ideally be listed directly with their custom tariff numbers, as this will allow for an easy mapping of products. Because again, Annex 1 of the EUDR lists all the in-scope products with the relevant numbers following the EU's combined nomenclature coding system. So once you have created that product list, it will allow you to map your company's products against the products listed in Annex 1 of the EUDR, and this can be a relatively straightforward task. Again, if all commodities, all products are already listed with their custom tariff number. If any of your listed products pops up in the annex, you are affected by the EUDR. And once that is given, we recommend to check whether your company is behaving as an operator, so placing products on the EU market for the first time, or a trader, distributing the products which have already been placed on the EU market. And it's also worth to check whether your company meets the thresholds of a small or medium-sized undertaking, as this can impact the scope of obligations that apply. And we'll have a look at that later. So here, the usual SME thresholds apply with undertakings of less than 250 employees and a balance sheet of less than 20 million euros and or a net turnover of less than 40 million euros. That for assessing the scope, understanding whether you as a company are in scope of the EUDR or not. Now, let's have a look at the requirements that need to be fulfilled under the EUDR if you are in scope. Before you can place a product on the union market, it has to meet 3 preconditions. First, it needs to be deforestation free. Note here that deforestation means the conversion of forest to agricultural use, whether human-induced or not. And it is not only limited to illegal deforestation, as was the case with the EU timber regulation. Under the EUDR, this consequently means that deforestation-free is only a product that has been produced on land that has not been deforested after 31st of December 2020. So we have a very clearly defined cutoff date here. In the case of soy, for example, the soybean flour that you may produce and sell may not be made of soy that has been cultivated on land in, let's say, Argentina, that has been converted from forest land into land for agricultural use after this date. In the case of wood, the wood needs to have been harvested from forests without inducing any forest degradation after this date, so 31st December 2022. So no conversion of primary forest into plantation forest or other wooded land may have occurred after that date. Second, proof is required that the production complies with the legal requirements of the producing country. And here the EUDR defines certain types of legislations, including, for example, environmental protection and forest-related rules, but also land use rights, labor rights, human rights protected under international law, as well as tax, anti-corruption, trade and customs regulation. It also requires that the production is legally sound with respect to the principle of free, prior and informed consent, which requires the information and consultation with indigenous peoples in the country of origin. Third requirement is that the product always needs to be covered by a due diligence statement, which needs to be submitted prior to placing or making available that product on the market or exporting it. And this statement needs to confirm that you as a company have adequately exercised due diligence and that no or only a negligible risk was found that the product is not deforestation free and or has not been produced in accordance with local legislation. And in addition, the statement needs to include certain predefined information, including descriptions on the product and its quantity, the product's HS codes, details on the country of production, and geolocation coordinates. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And then you can also include references to other due diligence statements submitted in relation to that product. Again, here also the regulation text itself, Annex 2 of the EUDR, provides a template for this due diligence statement that will help you better understand what this statement should look like. Now, to be able to submit this statement and to write that statement, companies are required to exercise due diligence. And the EUDR defines a three-step due diligence approach, which includes the collection of information, the execution of a risk assessment, and the implementation of risk mitigation measures in those cases where risks have been identified. And to properly exercise this due diligence, companies are of course also required to implement adequate governance and reporting mechanisms. So kind of like putting it into an entire system, which allows them to establish and regularly update the necessary underlying procedures and measures, and to have someone assigned that is responsibility for the process, etc. But let's briefly focus on those three core elements of the due diligence. First, companies are required to gather a variety of very detailed information. And this information relates to describing the product and its quantity, of course, but then also to list all countries of production and especially the geolocation coordinates of all the plots of land where relevant commodities have been cultivated. You also need to make sure that you gather information on the suppliers who have supplied you with a product, but also the recipients that you are selling the products to, as well as any other verifiable information that you have to show that the product is deforestation-free and has been made in accordance with local legislation. Second, companies are required to evaluate the risks that their products are non-compliant. And in doing so, they're asked to take into account different risk criteria that the EUDR predefines. On the one hand side, you're supposed to take into account the country risk as to be defined by the EU Commission. Note here, this is foreseen to be a country risk benchmarking system, which is still work in progress. The Commission originally planned to adopt that by end of this year. Now it has already been postponed to not before summer next year. So let's see whether and how that is coming. But theoretically, you need to take into consideration a level of country risk. You also need to take into consideration the presence of forests and prevalence of deforestation or forest degradation in the country of production, and then also the presence and consultation with indigenous peoples, as well as any other country-specific concerns related to, for example, the level of corruption and lack of law enforcement, which can further increase the risk of deforestation occurring or the risk of non-compliance with local laws. Third, companies are required to implement and document measures which can mitigate risks to a negligible level. And this may include requesting additional data from your suppliers, carrying out third-party audits on site, but also having policies in place, control mechanisms, procedures to really manage the risk of non-compliance, adjust contractual terms, etc. So here again, that very much depends on your supply chain and supplier base. So that is the due diligence system that you need to have in place, the processes that you need to establish to ensure compliance. And once you have done that, once you have exercised due diligence, you are ready to submit the due diligence statement. And this due diligence statement needs to be submitted to the information system and always ahead of placing or making available the product on the market or exporting it. The information system will be established hopefully by end of this year and will then be accessible to competent authorities, customs authorities, and of course the operators and traders. And here, the due diligence statement that you need to submit, again, needs to include several key information elements. And the most important, I would argue, and also the most challenging one for sure, is the geolocation information requirement. So here you're really very much required to trace back every relevant commodity to its plot of land. That said, every due diligence statement is connected to the relevant product batch. So every time a company intends to place or make available or export a relevant product, it needs to indicate this information in a statement. And here, the due diligence statement or the information cannot be aggregated or submitted, let's say, once a year or every quarter of the year. No, it needs to be submitted for each import or for each placing on the market, and it always needs to be product specific. Now, we know by now that the EUDR also applies to companies further down in the supply chain who may source an in-scope product from an EU-based supplier. So here, the requirements already apply for the product and for the supplier in the EU that has placed that product on the market. In those cases, companies can refer to due diligence statements that have previously been submitted for that product by including the respective reference number into their own due diligence statement. We'll have a look at that just right after that slide. But important again here to understand is that those due diligence statements are crucial to prepare and to submit, because competent authorities in the different member states will carry out checks on exactly the validity of these due diligence statements. Now, I have mentioned companies further down in the supply chain can reference due diligence statements of their suppliers. And to kind of put that into perspective, let's have a look at how and where exactly the EUDR's obligations differ. The EUDR generally differentiates between operators and traders, but then also between non-SME, so large operators and traders, and SME, so small and medium-sized operators and traders. If we look at the large operators and traders, both have to fulfill the same full due diligence obligations. So here, the differentiation between operator and trader actually doesn't really matter that much. What does that mean? That means that both need to exercise due diligence for those products or parts of the product where no prior due diligence has been carried out. So especially in cases where they import for the first time a product on the union market, or where they produce an in-scope product and then place it on the market, they need to make sure they have exercised all the different steps and submit a due diligence statement. In cases where products have already been subject to due diligence, so in the case, for example, of a large trader that buys and resells chocolate from a European supplier, the company does not necessarily need to exercise due diligence for this product, but it is required to check whether due diligence has been previously carried out adequately. So it has to check, did my supplier adequately exercise its due diligence, and do I have all the necessary information on this? Because importantly, still the large trader retains legal responsibility in the event of a breach of the regulation. That said, the EU does not yet really clarify what this adequacy check should encompass, which in turn leaves some leeway for companies to set up their own respective processes. But yeah, a very crucial step for you to make sure, does my supplier fulfill the due diligence exercise adequately? And in any case, large operators and traders then need to submit a due diligence statement, again, in which they can also include the reference numbers to the previously submitted due diligence statements. Moreover, they are required to pass on all relevant information showing that due diligence has been exercised to actors also further down in the supply chain. So there is this requirement of exchanging information within the supply chain. When it comes to SMEs, the differentiation between operators and traders matters a bit more. Similar to the obligations of large operators, SME operators need to exercise due diligence and submit a due diligence statement for those products or parts of the product where no prior due diligence has been carried out. In cases where products have already been subject to due diligence, the SME operator has no due diligence obligations and is also not obliged to submit a due diligence statement. But it would need to provide a list or information on the relevant due diligence statement reference numbers to the national competent authorities if asked to do so. And again, here the requirement applies to really pass on information within the supply chain, and also the SME operators are liable in cases of non-compliance. SME traders, in turn, have less strict obligations to fulfill. They only need to make sure to really collect and keep the relevant information on their product to suppliers and recipients, as well as the relevant reference numbers to their due diligence statements, and provide them upon request. Now, who needs to do what in the end? Let's recap that applicability with a brief practical example. Let's assume that we have a company active in the business-to-business baking goods and food processing industry. This company is based in the EU and places on the market relevant in-scope products such as soybean flour for meat alternatives, and also chocolate. However, it also sells products that are not in scope, such as pastry, cakes, veggie sausages, milkshakes, you name it. Firstly, important, the EUDR applies for the in-scope products that the company places on the market by selling it to its customers. So in this case, EUDR applies to the soybean flour and to the chocolate. Therefore, the company needs to prepare a due diligence statement specific to those two types of products. This is the kind of like selling final products perspective. But then we also have the sourcing or supply chain perspective. Let's assume that the company is sourcing soybeans to produce its soybean flour and then cocoa paste to make its chocolate or to fill a chocolate paste into its chocolate croissants. Here it is important to know whether or not the company is importing from a non-EU based supplier, so supplier outside of the EU, or from an EU based supplier. In our case, the company sources the cocoa paste from a non-EU supplier. Therefore, the company is the one that is importing that commodity or that good for the first time into the European Union market. Consequently, also for that importing transaction, the EUDR applies, and our company has to make sure that it has a due diligence statement in place for this import. To produce its meat alternatives in soybean flour, the company then also sources soybeans, but this time the company sells this from an EU-based supplier. Consequently, the EUDR's requirements already apply to that supplier, and it is the supplier that needs to already submit a due diligence statement for the soybeans. But again, our company can or should check whether that supplier has adequately fulfilled the due diligence obligations to then use the information in its own due diligence statement. What is a crucial point here as well to understand is that the risk perspective is somewhat twofold. You as a company may either face the risk of non-compliance if you manage or if you fail to manage to meet the requirements for your own products that you are placing on the European Union market. But then at the same time, you're also facing a risk of supply chain disruptions if your suppliers, especially the ones that already need to fulfill the due diligence obligations themselves, do not adequately meet the obligations, and all of a sudden the soybeans, for example, get held back at the EU border. Now, with that, we have walked you through the main requirements, and before we look at how to get started or how to address those different requirements, we have prepared another brief poll for you. And we would like to better understand this time where you currently see the biggest challenges in preparing for the EUDR. And I know it can be probably multiple answer options that apply, but please make sure to just select the one where you say, as of now, that is our biggest challenge. Is it understanding what your obligations are? Is it more about securing the sufficient resources and budgets internally to build up the systems? Is it in tracing back the origins of your products, getting all the geolocation coordinate information? Is it handling cost increases due to or in raw materials? So yeah, you should see the poll coming up. Yes, there we go. So again, please select the answer option that suits your situation at the moment best. Well aware that there may be different challenges at the same time. And I can see the answers coming in. We have a clear majority. But let's see, let's wait a few more seconds. Perfect, thank you for that. And yes, you can already see that as of now, within that group of attendees, this traceability requirements are really getting the information back to the plots of land per product, per commodity is the major challenge. And yes, I can only agree to that. That is a crucial challenge and something that is maybe even almost impossible to meet according to the needs of the EUDR. So thank you for that transparency. And for those that selected understanding the obligations, I hope that after the webinar, you may already have a bit of a better understanding with that. Now, let's move to the final part of our presentation, look at how can companies prepare for the wide-ranging requirements. To get started, we recommend companies to focus on following preparatory actions. We recommend all of you to run the diagnostics first, and that the earlier the better. What do we mean by that? We mean that you check whether and how you are affected by the EUDR through your own products and the products you source. And we would call that an application check. So similar to the steps that I've presented earlier, we at LRQA also offer support in screening your products for EUDR applicability. Recently, for example, we just did it for a company and identified 10 times the number of products to be in scope than originally expected by the company. And that said, in cases where you already have done an application check, and I would assume at least those of you where you say, okay, this is a high priority topic, that you probably have already done an initial application check, we also offer support in doing an external review of your check so that you are really ready to prepare also respective client communication maybe. Next, once you have identified how are you in scope, we always advise to do a pragmatic gap analysis to see which processes you already have in place that you can draw on, including especially processes for supplier management and outreach. And based on the improvement areas that you may identify, we then advise, and of course can also help with that, to define kind of like an overarching strategy and roadmap that offers you a systematic and structured approach on how to close those gaps. So providing an overview of the key goals, activities, roles and responsibilities, and also timelines that you need to consider when setting up the necessary due diligence processes. This is then kind of like the second part of it, actually establishing the processes that you need. And for all three due diligence dimensions, so information gathering, risk assessment, and risk mitigation, we as the advisory team can support with conceptually designing, defining, piloting, and documenting the processes. But we can, of course, also support you with on-the-ground people that can actually implement the processes, following more of a program-managed approach. So when we look at information gathering, here it's important to set up these internal and external information gathering strategies. Very important to get all the necessary information you need for your due diligence statement. And again, this part is, we would argue, the most crucial element of it all, because if you don't have the relevant information, you cannot do the risk mitigation, the risk assessment, sorry, and then based on that derive the necessary risk mitigation measures. So that is really, or should be, the core task to do now, to set up processes to gather information. And that, of course, requires close engagement with your suppliers. So designing a supplier SAQ that makes sure that asks really the relevant questions. It could also include supplier trainings to really inform them about what do they need to answer, why, how, etc. And it can also relate to identifying third-party data providers that provide you with additional information on certain regions, countries, etc. that you will need. Once you have that information, a risk assessment is needed. So here it's again about defining a process that allows you to evaluate all the information you have gathered and then derive a level of risk of EUDR non-compliance based on that information. So again, here it's really important to conceptualize the risk assessment to make sure you have covered all the different risk criteria that the EUDR foresees, to see, okay, where do I need third-party additional data, where can I rely on supplier data? And in the end, it really just needs piloting, trying out, adjusting the processes so that you really have a sound process in place, latest by end of this year. And then risk mitigation is about deriving risk-based measures based on the results of your risk assessment. What is important here, what we would advise you to always keep in mind, is that a one-size-fits-all solution doesn't really work when it comes to risk mitigation measures. So you really should make sure that you select measures that suit your suppliers, that you identify a priority group of suppliers to focus on. And the measures then, again, can range from, for example, supplier trainings on-site or remote. We do offer, for example, courses also on deforestation with our EIQ Learn platform. It could also include on-site assessments, so doing an audit, or it can relate to gathering additional information through FAQs, etc. Again, very much depends on the results of your risk assessment. And of course, all the actions and results need to be tracked, evaluated, and duly documented. With that, we have reached the end of our presentation. I'll hand over to Max again for a few brief key takeaways. I can already see that we're a bit over the time, so let's make sure we have enough time to answer your questions. But over to you, Max.
Yes, I'll make it quick. You're correct, we're at the end of our presentation, and we have three key takeaways for you. First of all, we believe that there is not really a one-size-fits-all approach. That means that every company has to assess the EUDR requirements in light of their own specifics. And for assessing EUDR requirements, we suggest to be very clear about the scope of application for your individual company. So which products are in scope and which existing processes do you have in place that can help you comply? We suggest to get started with gathering all necessary information. We saw it on the poll right now. We also observe it to be this to be a major challenge for companies. Remember, there is not much time left, so the remaining time needs to be used wisely. Second, the involvement of and engagement with all relevant stakeholders will probably facilitate the implementation and the necessary elements of a EUDR-proof compliance management system. So involve your suppliers and carry out risk assessments covering indicators beyond deforestation for compliance with local legislation also and international guiding principles. And then third, a holistic approach, not only focusing on the basic requirements of the EUDR, can also have substantial advantages. So addressing other risks related to environmental degradation, labor risks, labor rights, human rights, and other supply chain risks beside deforestation can help to mitigate the overall risk of supply chain disruptions. So knowing these risks and having mitigation measures in place is key for future-proofing and for responsible sourcing. Yeah, as with every comprehensive due diligence system, it needs time to be established. So the earlier you start, the better. All right, thank you very much for your attention. We can jump into your questions. We have received a number of questions during the presentation, from which we can address a few in the remaining time.
Yes. Maybe, Max, I'll actually just start with when I started to screen them.
Perfect.
And I saw a question that I guess also quite a few people raised. So the company is buying an in-scope product, so from a supplier that has already placed that product on the EU market for the first time. And the question is whether they're still expected to exercise full due diligence if they're not an SME. And that is a good question to discuss that again, because the question is now, okay, do you buy the in-scope product to then use it in your own product, make a different product out of it that is in the end not in scope, or do you buy it and resell it as a trader? If you are, like in the case of the latter, you are buying the in-scope product and then selling it again as it is, as a large trader, yes, the due diligence requirements would apply. You're expected to exercise full due diligence. You need to submit a due diligence statement yourself. But again, you are, of course, able to rely or use the information from your supplier that has already exercised the due diligence. So here it's very much about making sure, how do you check whether your supplier has exercised adequate due diligence? And is that for you as a company sufficient? Do you want to do any extra checks, or do you trust the information you receive? If you trust it, you can pretty much use that information, submit your own due diligence statement, and have fulfilled the due diligence exercise. Now, the other cases where you buy an in-scope product and then use it for your own business activities, but you don't sell in the end an in-scope product. So here, it's again important to check, by buying that in-scope product, are you importing? Now, based on the question, I assume no, because it has been already placed on the EU market. So theoretically, and looking very strictly at the EU regulation, EUDR regulation, here you would not have any requirements, because you're not importing and you're not yourself placing any in-scope product on the market. However, we would also like to highlight here that lawyers tend to differ here in their assessment of whether the EUDR applies in those cases or not. So some lawyers do interpret the EUDR in a way that as soon as you are purchasing an in-scope product, even from an EU supplier, and even if you only use it for your own manufacturing processes, you are considered a trader and therefore should submit a due diligence statement, or at least prepare for that scenario that the national competent authorities will enforce it as such. But then again, we have also spoken to other law firms that would not interpret the law that strictly. So they say, no, if you're only purchasing it and making a different product out of it, then the obligations do not apply. So here again, at some point depends a bit also on the risk appetite of your company, whether you want to prepare for the requirements or not. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question, but I hope it answered the question. Maybe speaking actually about enforcement, Max, do you want to answer the question on national competent authorities and how they plan to enforce the EUDR?
Yes, of course, I can take that question. Exactly, the question was who are national competent authorities that will enforce the EUDR, and how are they planning to enforce it? So the EU Commission has published a list of competent authorities. It's not yet defined for all countries, but we know for a couple of countries already. For example, in Germany, it's going to be the Bundesanstalt für Landwirtschaft und Ernährung. We also know it for the Netherlands and for France. We will make sure to provide a link to the published list of competent authorities in the webinar follow-up mail, so that you can check that list. The plan is that these local authorities will check annually and based on a 3-level risk approach how operators and traders are complying. And that will mean annual checks will cover 3% of operators and traders from trading relevant products from standard risk countries. So there's this country benchmarking system that the EU is planning here, and if countries are get a standard risk, then 3% of operators and traders are going to be checked here. If they are from high-risk countries, there's a plan to check for 9% of traders and operators, and for low-risk countries, the level is going to be 1%. However, at the moment, all countries are assigned a standard risk. This EU benchmarking system has not been published yet, and there's still a lot of discussion around this right now. But remember, if you are checked and a non-compliance is found, there are potential sanctions. We talked about it in the beginning. There are fines proportional to environmental damage caused. Can be up to 4% of turnover. There can be confiscation of commodities, or also confiscation of revenues gained from their sale. Exactly.
Then
Selena,
maybe I'll take on
questions.
Yeah, I'll take on another question concerning the collection of information and whether the country of production and geolocation information is required for the forests where the company is harvesting. So again, here I would say generally probably yes. It depends a bit on your company specific case. So it depends on, do you in the end place relevant products on the European Union market or export it there from? I assume you have checked that. And if there are wood-related products that are in scope, then yes, you need to exercise the due diligence, and you have to make sure that you are able to provide the geolocation specific information in your due diligence statement, meaning all the plots of land where the forests are from which you have where the wood has been cultivated that you are then using in your wood-based products. So that requirement applies in any case. Maybe somewhat related to that is a question on the level of due diligence or scrutiny in that sense that will be required, and how we consider whether this will be a tick boxing exercise. So here, I mean, it will depend a bit on how the national competent authorities decide to enforce the EUDR requirements in the end, how strictly they enforce it, in how much detail they screen the due diligence statements, they verify whether the plots of land that you have indicated really match the type of commodity that you have indicated, etc. So that there is not much guidance on that available yet, so it'll be seen how strictly that will be enforced. That brings me to the point that, again, it depends a bit on how what's your risk appetite as a company. Do you say, okay, let's try with the best effort approach, do the most we can, but then if we can't get all the different plots of land, we just circle a region, provide the geocoordinates of a region. That could be one approach, but then again, you have to remember that you retain legal responsibility for that region that you then insert, and you need to make sure that you assess the risk, etc., for that region. Or are you a company that is really very careful and really needs to or wants to make sure it has all the exact information? In that case, you may want to send people really on the ground to actually meet people at the farms to check whether the geocoordinates are correct, or to even start gathering them first of all. So again, here it really much depends on your company and how much of a strategic and important topic you consider that. That said, we were in touch with a company, for example, that was considering to completely scratch off the business one of the in-scope products in the EU to level out the costs of compliance. So yeah, again, in the end, a strategic decision, I would argue. Looking at the time, we have 2 minutes left. Maybe I'll close with one more question, and on that note, we'll make sure to get back to you with any questions that we have not answered yet. And please also feel free to just send out an email if you have any additional questions, if you want to jump on a call with us. Very happy to do so and provide further information. But there's a question also on fulfilling other due diligence laws. So if I am already fulfilling other due diligence laws, such as the German Due Diligence Act or the upcoming EU CSDD, do I still need to apply the EUDR requirements? General answer to that, yes, you still need to fulfill the EUDR requirements if your company is in scope of the EUDR with its products. And it's important here that to kind of be aware of the synergies, but also differences between these different legislations, because in the end, they are all due diligence laws. So the obligations and measures that you have to take in terms of supplier outreach, information gathering, risk assessment, risk mitigation measures are all quite similar. However, the perspective is slightly different. With the EUDR and also the upcoming EU forced labor product ban, for example, the focus is very much on the products. And with the CSDD and also the German Supply Chain Act, focuses more on the company and operations and the suppliers themselves. That said, for the CSDD, for example, deforestation is also mentioned as one potential negative impact that you need to consider. So here you would already kind of cover that element. So yeah, short answer, you need to make sure you fulfill all the different requirements and be very much aware of the different interlinkages and differences. And again, also at LRQA, we're very happy to help you with that, to do a gap analysis and identify where and how processes may need to be adjusted specific to the legislation. And with that, it's end of the webinar. We're right on time. So for me, only left to say thank you very much for your attendance, for your great questions. You will again receive a link to the webinar and the slides via email in due time. We will also make sure to include the links to the relevant documents that we have mentioned. And before you jump off the webinar, please do share your feedback and any comments you may have in the brief questionnaire that will pop up once you exit the webinar. That will help us very much as well. And please also have a look at our website and our LinkedIn account to stay informed on any upcoming webinars on, for example, the CSDD, CSRD, etc. So thank you so much and have a good rest of the day. Talk to you very soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.